Welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is the third in a multi-part series that I am calling Sacred Words because we are looking at terms that have been important and still are important to many religious traditions around the world. We've already looked at a number of these in the first two episodes, and this will be the third episode where we look at more terms. So let's begin. The first term we're going to look at is the term magic. The term magic, we've actually had a whole episode on this. It was the second episode that we had in Word Safari, so I guess I must think this is an important term because it was the second thing I decided to ever make an episode about. So we're only going to kind of hit the highlights here because there is an episode that you can watch on this, and some of you probably already have watched it. I'll go ahead and put a link up here to it. Just to review, the term magic comes from the Greek word magike, which was originally an adjective that meant pertaining to some source of power outside the norm. In other words, there was already a concept of weirdness baked into that term magike, and it described things that were perhaps outside the norm for the ancient Greeks. That adjective comes from a noun, magos, who was someone who practiced some kind of what we might call supernatural power or activity that was considered outside the norm by the ancient Greeks, and that term was borrowed from the Old Persian language, and specifically the word magush. There was some interesting geopolitical activity going on at this time period in the 5th century BC between the Greeks and the Persians. Specifically, there was a war going on. The Persians were a rapidly expanding empire who tried to invade the Greeks a couple times and failed both times. So the Greeks didn't necessarily trust or even necessarily like the Persians, but they did understand that they were wealthy and powerful and knowledgeable. So they took this word that honestly just meant a priest in the Old Persian language. The official religion of the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism, so these would have been Zoroastrian priests practicing their religion. The Greeks took one look at them and said, those people are weird compared to what we, the Greeks, do, and so they actually took this term that really just meant priest and used it to mean kind of a weirdo of some kind, and honestly many cultures have probably done this over the years, but ultimately this is where we trace our term magic back to. Where did the Persians get this word magush in their native language? They also spoke an Indo-European language, just like the Greeks, just like we do, who are speaking English. And so this term magush comes from an Indo-European root mag, which just meant to be able or capable or powerful. It's cognate with our English terms may and might. So really a magush, etymologically in Old Persian, just meant someone with power or capability. That's essentially the term that they use to refer to their priests. A little bit later on, we get the term magi, which is actually just the Latin plural of magus, which comes from the Greek magos. So the Romans took this directly from the Greeks, and the magi, of course, are famous in the Christmas story, where they show up and give gifts to the baby Jesus coming from the east, aka maybe Babylonia, Persia, that kind of area. And so there's a lot that we could dive into with that, but that is ultimately where the magi come from as well. And so that is where we get our term magic. We've already looked at the term religion in a previous episode, and this is sort of the counterpoint to that. Let's go on and look at another term that sometimes is considered today to maybe be some kind of counterpoint in some way to religion, and that is the word cult. The word cult actually comes from a very banal Latin word, and that Latin word is cultus. As you can see, it looks very similar. This was a Latin word that had nothing to do with cults in the modern sense per se. It actually just meant care, like taking care of something, or labor, working at something, or revering something, or someone. We get other words in English from this Latin word like cultivate. If you cultivate a plot of earth and you're a farmer, you're taking care of it, you're working at it, you're even revering it, you're respecting it enough to give it some labor and some water and some love in some ways, right? We also get the word culture from this because culture is that which is sort of cultivated within a certain group of people that makes them a unit. That's essentially what a culture is. So we get a number of words that have nothing to do with cults, as you can see, like cultivate and culture, from this Latin root. So you can already tell that this was not a weird word in the ancient Latin language. It actually just meant the care of the gods when it was used for what we would call religious purposes. Again, it could be used for taking care of other things, like I said, like a field if you were a farmer. But they used this to refer to the way that, as they saw it, they took care of the gods. The gods wanted their worship, they wanted their reverence, they wanted their attention, their prayers, their sacrifices, etc. We're going to look at those two words later in this episode, and so they used this word to refer to the ways that they cared for the gods, they thought about the gods, and in modern terms, they practiced their religion. I probably don't need to tell you today that in English, the word cult has a pretty negative definition. If you say somebody's part of a cult, you're probably not trying to say something good about them, but this negative definition is entirely modern. This was not the way that this word was ever used, and in scholarship about the ancient world, we still talk about ancient cult and things like that in a neutral way. So when we say the ancient cult of Zeus, we don't mean that Greeks were part of a modern day cult. That's not what we mean. We're actually just talking about the way that people worshipped Zeus or perhaps practiced their religion. So that's the term cult. We've looked at the term anathema in a previous episode, and I'll go ahead and put a link up here, but just to remind you what this term meant, it comes from the two Greek words, the Greek prefix ana, which we have also looked at in a previous episode, which means up, and the Greek root the, which means to put, and yes, we have looked at that in a previous episode too. The original meaning of anathema was something that was laid or put up, and in this sense, it was something that was stored in maybe a temple or devoted to the gods. Oftentimes, if you wanted to give something to a particular god, you would take it to their temple and dedicate it to them and devote it to them. That's essentially what an anathema originally was. So kind of like the word cult, this has come to mean something negative, but it did not originally mean something negative. However, in this case, the decline into negativity actually started to occur already over 2,000 years ago, because the idea of something that was anathema was that if you dedicated it to the gods, you weren't allowed to take it back, because of course then the gods would get very upset with you and you would be under a curse. So something that was anathema is something that you could not take back without being under a curse, and maybe that particular thing was also under a curse if you decide to touch it or mess with it. And that's where our negative idea comes from. Ultimately, it got used to something or someone that is completely rejected by whatever community you are a part of, because you don't want to touch it because it's under a curse, and you might be under a curse if you decide to touch whatever this thing is that is anathema. Okay, let's talk about the word prophet. The word prophet comes from, again, kind of like with anathema, a Greek prefix and then a Greek root. In this case, the Greek root is phemi, which actually just means to speak. And then the Greek prefix, going back to our prefixes, means pro, which means forth, forward, something like that. Pretty similar to the Latin prefix pro as well. So you can kind of put these two together. And by the way, the tes ending is just a noun suffix in Greek. So you put those two together plus the noun suffix, and really what you get is someone who speaks out or speaks forth or, speaks to a bunch of people. That's actually the meaning of the word prophet. Notice that there's nothing inherently in there about telling the future. Now today when we use the word prophet, a lot of times we mean someone who tells the future or knows the future or something like that, but that was not necessarily implicit in the original meaning of the word prophet. In fact, if you go back to the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and read the prophets, read Isaiah, read Jeremiah, read some of these other individuals, you'll notice that a lot of what they're doing is just speaking out. What they're doing is confronting powerful people. A lot of times they are confronting the king of Israel or Judah at the time, and they're telling them, hey, you need to stop being a jerk. Basically, you need to be nicer to people, you need to be nicer to the poor, you need to make better decisions. These are the kinds of things that prophets are often doing. They're confronting powerful people. In many ways, they're figures of what we would today call social justice. We've coined that term obviously much more recently than Bible times, but that's essentially what prophets would do. Now, sometimes when they were carrying out these duties of warning powerful people to stop being jerks, they would give them warnings and say, hey, if you don't stop doing this, then God is going to smite you, or this other thing is going to happen that's not good and you don't want it to happen. So they definitely would foretell the future, but it's often a conditional future that, again, is conditioned on you, not being a jerk anymore, maybe continuing to be a jerk, and then these bad things are going to happen. So that's the original meaning of being a prophet, and you can see it in the etymology when you break it down. How about the word priest? Priest is another religious official that many cultures have had. Where do we get our word priest from? Interestingly, it goes back to the Greek word presbyter, which just meant elder. The Greek adjective presbus meant old, and we have terms like presbyopia, which is actually an eye condition that literally means old eyes. It's something that obviously mostly happens to people of advanced age. A presbyter was an elder, and yes, you probably have heard of the denomination in Christianity called the Presbyterian Church today, which is actually just the elders' church. It's literally the group of people led by elders, not by the Pope, not by a bishop, but a council of elders. That's literally what the Presbyterian Church means. How did we get from the Greek word presbyter to the modern word priest? Well, it went through Latin, like many things do, and in vulgar Latin, in other words, the spoken Latin of the late Roman Empire and early Middle Ages, presbyter was spoken so much that it got eroded or contracted to prester. Basically, that whole middle syllable just sort of fell out, and it came to be the word prester. That was in French, and then that got borrowed from French into English as priest. And so ultimately, we get the word priest from prester, which was this contraction of this Greek word. So our word priest comes from an original term that does mean elder, like someone who is advanced in age. However, that doesn't necessarily have to be the way that your language gets its word for priest. In fact, ancient languages like Latin and Greek did not get their word for priest from a root that meant elder or old in their language. They both actually got it from a root, their own roots that meant sacred. So the most common term for priest in Latin was sacerdos, and you can see sacred there at the beginning of that. So a sacerdos was a priest, which literally in Latin meant someone who was sacred, someone who was set apart, someone who is holy in some way, shape, or form. We've talked about the word holy in a previous episode as well. The Greek word for priest was hieros, and this also comes from the hier root, which is seen all over the ancient Greek language that also means sacred. So basically, sacerdos and hieros in Latin and Greek meant something very similar to each other. They both meant sacred or holy or set apart, and they didn't necessarily have anything to do with being an elder. So it's interesting to see the semantic developments as they occur. Speaking of roots that mean sacred, how about the word sacrifice? This is another term that we have looked at in a previous episode when we were looking at words that come from the Latin fac root, F-A-C. That's the F-I-C of sacrifice. You might recall that this means to do or to make, and if not, here's a link that you can go check this out if you would like. So the word sacrifice comes from these two Latin words, sacrum, which means sacred or holy. It's this root that we were just talking about, plus fac, which means to make or to do, which is the root that I was just telling you about or reminding you of. And so the original meaning of sacrifice was to take something and make it holy, which means setting it apart from normal human experience, which in this context means dedicating it to the gods or to whatever god it is that you are sacrificing something to. So you had a priest who was a sacerdos making something sacred, which was sacrum, okay? They would sacrificare something, and so you can see that the word for priest and the word for what the priest does in a language like Latin actually go together in a way that they don't necessarily go together in a language like English. I'm sure we could conjecture that maybe this is because the use of priests and the job of priests in, say, Christianity does not involve sacrificing an animal. So maybe there's an interesting point to be made here that these two words have separated, etymologically speaking, because priests in, say, Christianity do not carry out this particular action any longer. But of course, as we know, in ancient Mediterranean religions, this was one of the most common things that priests would do. They would sacrifice, usually animals. There were plenty of other things that would be sacrificed or brought to be given to the gods as well, including grain and wine and other things like that. But animals would have been the biggest thing and the most common thing that would have been given over to the priests in order to be given over to the gods in turn. So again, to sacrifice literally means to make something holy, to dedicate it to the gods. That's essentially what the word sacrifice means. Today, of course, this word has evolved a little bit further semantically, and it's come to mean something like you're giving something up, but that was originally, a tangential meaning of the word to sacrifice. Yes, you're giving something up when you bring it to the priests to give it to the gods, but that wasn't necessarily the main point. The main point was that you are giving it to the gods, not necessarily that you are giving it up. So it's basically just a different perspective on the same action now that this term has evolved into modern English. What about the term prayer? Sacrifice was one of the big things that people in ancient religions, and certainly some still today, would have carried out. But we all know that prayer has always been a major factor in pretty much any religion around the world. I think it's safe to say that. Where do we get our word prayer from? Our word prayer in English comes from a similar Old French word prière, which in turn was an eroded form of the Latin term precaria, which means an ask, a request, something that you are begging. That's essentially what a precaria was, and that got eroded into Old French and then borrowed into English. So interestingly, from an etymological perspective, the term prayer is just a request, even though today we use it in a more general sense, right? If you're praying to a God that you believe in, you're going to oftentimes be asking for something, but maybe not necessarily, right? You may just be expressing thanks for something or whatever. So it's interesting that this word does come from a word that specifically means to ask or to request something. Interestingly, the cognate of this word prayer in English is precarious, because that goes back to that same Latin root, prec, which means to ask. There's a verb precor that also comes from this root as well, and there are a number of words in European languages today that are cognate with this Latin root prec that does mean to ask. So we have this adjective in English today, precarious. And if you're in a precarious situation, it's a slippery situation, it's a dangerous situation, it's a situation where you're not necessarily sure that everything is going to work out the way that you want it to. That's essentially what it means to be in a precarious situation. But etymologically, we can now define it like this: needing prayer to turn out well. It's not going to probably turn out well unless you get some kind of supernatural help. So you better start asking God or the gods or any spiritual force you believe in for help to get out of this particular situation. That is literally what it means to be precarious. So this is one of these things where when you go and look at the etymologies of things, you can start to make some interesting connections here to various words in modern English vocabulary that you may not have otherwise connected to each other. How about a couple of words? We're going to end this episode with a few words that have to do with the afterlife, as commonly believed in Abrahamic traditions today, and many other traditions as well, but these words are used in English, and so we're going to talk about these particular English words and where they come from. The term heaven is, of course, a well-known term that I don't need to explain to you. Interestingly, this term does not come from Greek or Latin, unlike many of the other terms that we have been looking at in this episode. Heaven comes from Old English, so it was already there in the old version of English that was spoken, say, 1500 years ago and a little bit longer than that. It comes straight from this Old English word helvon, which actually just meant sky, and that's actually true of most languages, and honestly, I think almost all languages in the ancient world. They didn't have separate words for sky and heaven. They just saw the sky and they called it the heaven. The heaven and the sky was the same thing, and they believed that the gods lived up there. That was the idea of heaven. It was maybe the abode of the gods. The gods were up and humans were down. Where does this word come from in Old English? We think it goes back to a Proto-Germanic root, heven or hemen. Notice that those are pretty similar. And probably that Proto-Germanic root comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, kem, which means to cover. So the K would become an H with Grimm's law, and then essentially you would get heaven or himen, and so that's where we think it comes from. The Greek term for heaven had nothing to do with this term. It was the Greek term Uranos, which was also the original sky god. It's Zeus's grandfather, if you know the genealogies in Greek mythology. And it may be connected to an ancient Indo-European root for the sky or heaven as well. The Latin term that was used for the sky or heaven was caelum, and Romance languages get their term for heaven from this today, like Spanish cielo, which can be the sky or heaven. As you can see, many languages still today have not necessarily distinguished these two, and they still use the same word. Same with French ciel, which is where we get our word ceiling from, which of course has nothing to do with heaven in the spiritual sense. It's just something that is above you if you're in a building, so it's very banal, as you can tell. Another word for heaven that we often use or bat around today is paradise. Where does paradise come from? Paradise, unlike heaven, is not a Germanic term. This does come from ancient Greek. It comes from the ancient Greek word paradisos, which actually originally meant a park, like a nice place with trees and fountains. You can kind of see a picture of a park there on your screen to kind of give you an idea of a stereotypical park. Now, what would a park be in the ancient world? Most people would not have had access to parks. Parks would have often or usually been owned by a very rich, wealthy, powerful person who would often be a king in a particular place. The Greeks seem to have first come into contact with the idea of parks when they talked to the Persians. Remember, the Persians were the neighboring empire. They were very rich, they were very powerful, and the Persian king was possibly the most powerful person in the world during those couple of centuries. And so the Persian king had his own park. He had his own area that was planted with a lot of nice trees, probably some fruit trees, a lot of shrubbery and water and things like that, probably irrigated because of the part of the world that it is in. The old Iranian term for this, or old Persian term for this, was paradisa. And you can see that the Greeks actually just stole that word right out of the old Persian language. Paradisos is the Greek mangling, or, a little bit of mangling of paradisa. That was the closest they could get to saying that in Greek. What did paradisa mean in Old Iranian? Well, as it turns out, pyri actually just means around. It's cognate with the Greek word peri, which you know about from words like perimeter, and which we have talked about on the episode that has to do with prefixes. These obviously are cognate because both Greek and Iranian languages go back to Indo-European. What does this dies word mean in Old Iranian? It actually just means a wall, and it happens to be cognate with the Greek word wall as well, tekos, although we don't get a lot of things from tekos. However, what it is cognate with is our native English word dough, because the original meaning of this word in Indo-European was something that is built or shaped or formed. And so what would you build walls out of? A lot of times you'd build them out of mud or something like that. Obviously, maybe there'd be some wood in the middle, but you might take the mud or some kind of plaster or whatever. Either way, the idea of a wall was originally something that was not just built out of wood, but something that was shaped, formed, plastered, whatever. So the original meaning of paradise is the walled around area. That's actually literally what paradisa meant in Old Iranian. Why would it need a wall around it? Well, it was just for the king, and the king would want to keep the rabble out of his private luxury garden, essentially. This wasn't just for anybody. And so he built a wall around it. That was essentially what a paradise originally was. Now, you can see that when the Greeks imported this term, or took this term over from the Persians, they started to use it in a more metaphorical term. It certainly could still mean a park or a really nice space that you would want to go spend time in, but it came to be a more metaphorical this idea that maybe it was a wonderful place. Any kind of wonderful place might be a paradise, even though originally it was something a little bit more literal, a park of some kind. And then ultimately, I probably don't need to tell you that this word came to mean a wonderful place that maybe isn't even necessarily part of this world, but is like a metaphorical or maybe spiritual future home for people who have earned it or have deserved it. So if you ultimately end up meriting it, you will go to the kind of place that only the rich people have in this world, a lovely green park with walls around it to keep out the other people who maybe have not earned it. We're going to talk about one more term here, and that is, of course, the opposite of heaven in the dualistic Abrahamic languages, and that is the word hell. Just like the word heaven, The word hell goes back to a Germanic term. It is not a Greek or Latin borrowing, so heaven and hell kind of go together in that sense in our language. Hell comes from the Old English word hell, which is usually spelled with one L, but of course pronounced very similarly. The original Germanic, in other words, English and Old Norse concept of hell was a kind of underworld area, and then this term was used by Christians when the early Germanic speakers were Christianized to refer to the underworld concept in Judeo-Christian belief systems. However, it was not originally used for that concept in Judeo-Christian belief systems. It comes from the Greek, the Proto-Germanic. I'm so used to saying Greek that I almost said Greek. Comes from the Proto-Germanic root halio, which we think comes from the Proto-Indo-European root kel. Again, you can see Grimm's law. The K became an H, so that would make sense. The Proto-Indo-European root kel means to conceal. So interestingly, if we're right about this, and I think we are, heaven and hell both have very similar etymologies, even though they're used in opposite ways today. Essentially, heaven is the thing that covers over the earth, and hell is the thing that is concealed or covered over under the earth. So that's actually pretty interesting that they both go back to pretty similar Indo-European roots. Now, I mentioned that this was used by Christian translators to translate older terms that may not have been exactly the same as those Germanic concepts that were originally used for this term hell. This term hell was used to translate the original Greek concept of Hades, which of course was originally not a Christian concept, but a concept from Greek mythology. It's an underworld, so you can see why they would use that. It's also used to translate the somewhat later Hebrew concept of Gehinnom, which means the Hinnom Valley, and that got translated, or rather rendered, into Greek as Gehenna, and that was a little bit later. So Gehenna is a concept that really develops in the period of Second Temple Judaism and on into the New Testament. So it gets used in the New Testament, not so much in the Old Testament. The Old Testament has a concept called Sheol, which is also essentially the underworld. Now, you've noticed that I've left out some of the parts that might be of particular interest here. Specifically, what did people who were speaking Old English prior to the Christianization of England and the Germanic tribes in general, what did those people think of heaven and hell? When they used these words in a pre-Christian environment, what did they mean by them? Well, of course, I could tell you, but I happen to know somebody whom many of you know as well, who can tell us quite a bit more about these things. So in the next episode, I'm going to talk to Dr. Jackson Crawford, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about those original ideas of heaven and hell in their Germanic context. See you then.